The first hit she landed wasn't physical, it was that voice, sharp, thin, cutting through the evening air the moment the door swung open. Catherine Carter looked dead at us, eyes cold as polished stone, and spat her words like poison. "Who are these dirty little cockroaches you let in my home?" Not quiet, not mistaken, not said under her breath. She meant every syllable, and for half a second, the world stopped moving. The porch light buzzed above us, the evening breeze cooled my neck, but nothing felt real except those words sitting between us like filth she expected someone else to clean up. Before I could even tighten my grip on my old canvas tote, Camille burst into view too fast, too bright, too desperate. "Mama! Daddy, hey!" she gasped, jumping between us and Catherine. Not to defend us. No. Her smile was stretched so thin it looked painful. "Please, y'all, don't mind her. She talks like that sometimes." That wasn't an apology. It wasn't even concern. It was damage control for them, not for us. Catherine didn't flinch. Her eyes dragged over my coat, my simple shoes, Samuel's worn belt. Judging, calculating, dismissing. The corner of her lip lifted in a smirk that didn't try to hide itself. "My name is Denise Hammond," and in that moment, standing on the Carters' immaculate porch, I understood exactly why Samuel told me to dress simple, quiet, and plain. He wanted to see who these people were when they thought we had nothing. Samuel stood beside me, shoulders relaxed, hands clasped lightly in front of him, calm in a way only a man who knows his worth can be. He gave me the smallest nod, a reminder, we came here to observe. Catherine finally stepped aside, muttering, "Come in," the words stripped of welcome. The hallway beyond her gleamed polished floors, curated art, a smell of roasted lamb blending with an expensive candle. Everything felt staged for guests who mattered, not us. Camille hovered behind me, fingers trembling as she smoothed her dress, avoiding my eyes entirely. Her embarrassment wasn't for what was done to us. Her embarrassment was that we were seen this way. Before we stepped farther in, Samuel leaned toward me, his voice low and steady. "Remember why we're here, baby?" I nodded, letting my face soften with a quiet humility people like Catherine mistake for weakness. Catherine's husband, Greg, appeared farther down the hall. He looked from Samuel to me, then to his wife's stiff posture. Something flickered across his face, uncertainty, maybe discomfort, but he said nothing. The house was beautiful, I'll give them that, but beauty without warmth feels like a museum, something you're allowed to look at but not belong to. My tote bag felt heavier in my hand, the frayed strap brushing my palm, exactly what I wanted them to see. Exactly how we planned it. 3 nights earlier, after Camille called with that strained excitement, "Mama, Donovan's parents want to have y'all over for dinner. Just come casual, okay?" Samuel sat beside me on our bed and said, "Let's go simple, poor, and naive. Let them show us their hearts before they see ours." We kept our good things at home. We kept our real lives quiet. We walked into their picture-perfect house as blank canvases they thought they could paint over. Before I go any further, if you're listening to me now, type in the comments where you're watching from. I want to see how many people know what it feels like to be judged before you even cross a doorway. Donovan appeared at last, offering a strained smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Hammond, welcome." His handshake with Samuel was firm, respectful, but the tension in his eyes said he already knew this night wasn't going where he hoped. We moved toward the dining room. Catherine followed, her stare dragging across my back, lingering like glue. She wanted us to feel small. I didn't give her the satisfaction. But when I reached my chair, her eyes sharpened because she realized I wasn't shrinking at all. The smell hit me first, the kind of scent you only get from candles that come in heavy glass jars with foreign names. Underneath it was something roasted and rich from the kitchen, but the perfume of money was stronger. It clung to the air, to the walls, to the way everything in that house sat in its place, like it had somewhere better to be than around us. The entryway opened into a living room that looked like it had stepped out of a magazine and never been touched again. Cream couch, glass coffee table, big artwork on the wall with a price tag hiding in the frame. Not a toy, not a stray shoe, not a single thing out of order. My eyes moved over it all, and I felt a strange little ache in my chest, not from envy, just from knowing exactly what kind of performance we had walked into. Catherine's voice floated behind me, light and sharp at the same time. "I always tell Donovan," she said, "some people are just more comfortable in humble things." Her gaze slid down my coat again, slow enough that I could feel the fabric shrinking under it. Camille pretended to adjust her earring so she wouldn't have to look at me. That pretense hurt far more than Catherine's words. Samuel let out a soft breath, the kind that barely moved his chest. "Humble can be peaceful," he said easily. "We like what we're used to." There was no challenge in his tone, no bite. To anyone else, it would have sounded like agreement. To me, it sounded like a man planting his feet. Catherine smiled, too many teeth showing. "Of course," she replied. "Some folks just aren't used to elegant spaces. It can be a lot." She gestured vaguely up at the high ceiling, the chandelier, the carefully placed vases. I could tell she wanted me to be impressed, wanted me to show it on my face so she could relax into superiority. I gave her a small nod and let my eyes rest on a framed black and white photograph on the far wall instead. A younger version of Greg in a suit stood there, shaking hands with some local official. The frame was thick and heavy, the kind bought to say, "Look who I know." Camille moved closer to me, her voice low. "Mama, can I take your coat?" I slid it off my shoulders slowly, giving myself time to tuck whatever I was feeling back behind my ribs. "Thank you, baby," I said. The words slipped out on habit, warm and familiar, even though nothing in this house felt like mine. She took the coat carefully, then let her eyes flick over my dress, that thrift store blue cotton I'd pulled out on purpose. Her mouth tightened just a little at the sight. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. "Simple tastes last longer," Samuel added, walking his gaze around the room as if he were admiring it. "You don't have to worry about breaking what you can't afford to replace." Greg, who had been hovering near the hallway, finally let out a short chuckle. "I like that," he said. His voice had that practiced calm of a man used to being listened to. "But sometimes you work hard so you can afford nicer things, you know." He said it to the room, but his eyes landed on our shoes. "I suppose it depends on what you call nicer," I answered, still gentle. My hands folded together in front of me, fingers laced so I wouldn't reach for Samuel's arm. Some people like glass and shine, some people like quiet and space to breathe. For a second, the room went still. Donovan shifted his weight. Camille's jaw moved like she was chewing on words she couldn't swallow or spit out. Catherine laughed softly, the sound polished and empty. "Oh, I don't mean anything by it," she said. "It's just, everyone's different. Some of us grow up around certain standards, and others." She let the sentence fall like an open drawer, leaving the contents for us to imagine. I turned my head just enough to catch her eyes. "I understand," I said. "You like what you're used to, too." Her smile faltered for the smallest moment, then snapped back into place. Camille stared down at her own hands, twisting her wedding band. She still hadn't looked me full in the face since we stepped inside. That avoidance was louder than anything her mother-in-law could say. Samuel took a slow walk around the room, his hands behind his back, studying a shelf of neatly arranged books and glass. If anyone else had done it, it would have looked nosy. On him, it looked like quiet curiosity. Years of boardrooms and hospital corridors had settled into his shoulders, even without the expensive suit. "This is nice," he said. "You keep it very clean." Catherine straightened a throw pillow that was already straight. "We believe in presentation," she replied. "You never know who might walk through your door." Her eyes dipped to my tote again. The words landed heavy between us. I felt something settle inside me, some line being drawn, some decision hardening. I didn't show it on my face. I just smoothed my dress and stayed where I was, a guest in a house that wanted me small. Greg glanced at the clock on the wall, then clapped his hands together once, a little too brisk. "Well," he said, clearing his throat. "We're running late, let's go sit." The dining room looked like the kind of place where people took pictures of the table before they touched the food. Long, polished wood, tall-backed chairs, cloth napkins folded into shapes that didn't make sense. A row of wine glasses waited at every setting like they knew they were part of the show. Catherine took her seat at the head of the table as if a camera were on her. Greg sat at the other end, hand on the back of his chair, nodding for the rest of us to find our places. Camille led Samuel and me to the middle, across from her and Donovan. It was a smart arrangement, close enough to manage us, not close enough to look equal. As soon as I sat down, I felt the weight of that table. Not the wood, the eyes. Being seated there was not the same as being welcomed. It felt like being placed under a light. A young woman, probably a hired server for the night, came in with a tray of salad plates. She moved quietly, setting them down one by one. Greens, a few slices of something yellow, a drizzle of dressing that glistened like it belonged on television. "This looks nice," I said softly, more to the girl than anyone else. She gave me the smallest smile before catching herself and turning away. Catherine picked up her fork and tapped the table twice, not loud, but enough to pull the focus back to her. "So," she began, letting the words stretch, "what do you two actually do?" Her eyes landed on Samuel first, then slid to me. The question wasn't simple. It carried measurements. Samuel wiped his hands on his napkin before answering, calm and steady. "We work," he said. "Been working a long time." She waited, eyebrows lifted just enough to say his answer wasn't good enough. Greg speared a piece of lettuce, pretending to be disinterested, but his ear was turned our way. "I handle people," Samuel added. "Care, scheduling, making sure things run smooth. It's not fancy, but it's serious work." None of that was a lie. It just left out the parts that would have changed the temperature in that room. I saw Donovan nod slightly, respectful. He knew enough from Camille's stories to understand there was more under Samuel's words. Catherine only heard, "Not fancy." Her mouth curled. "Oh," she said. "So like, staff work?" "Hands on," Samuel agreed. "We like knowing the people we're responsible for." She hummed as if that confirmed something she'd already decided about us. Her fork moved slow through the salad, pushing leaves aside like they offended her. "And your place?" Greg cut in, eyes still on his plate. "You rent or you own?" He threw the question out there like it was nothing, but the room tightened around it. "We live in a house that's been good to us," I answered. "Been in it a long time." He looked up then, studying my face. "So you rent," he concluded. I smiled, not correcting him. "We take care of where we live," I said. "That's what matters." Across from me, Camille brought her wine glass to her lips. Her hand trembled just enough to make the liquid catch the light. She fixed her gaze on her plate, cheeks pink, acting like she couldn't hear the way her parents were being weighed and labeled across the table. "You must love simple living," Catherine added, her tone almost cheerful. "Less to worry about, less to lose." The words were too smooth to be innocent. She wanted them to sting and still leave her room to deny it later. "Simple doesn't mean small," I replied. "Sometimes it just means peaceful." Samuel's knee brushed mine under the table. It ground me, reminded me of nights when dinner was one pot and two spoons and we still found ways to laugh. We had walked through too much life to let this woman shrink us to our outfits and a few missing details. Donovan shifted in his chair. "Camille always talks about your cooking, Mrs. Hammond," he said quickly, trying to redirect the energy. "She says nobody makes Sunday dinners like you." There it was, a lifeline tossed into the middle of a cold pool. I grasped it just enough to stay afloat. "I like feeding people," I said. "You stretch what you have, you season it right, you give thanks, and it usually turns out fine." Catherine's lips twisted. "I suppose when you cook at home all the time, you get used to making do," she said. "We prefer private chefs for bigger meals, less stress." Something in the way she said "cook at home" made it sound like scrubbing floors. Cooking at home was where I learned to survive and love at the same time. Late nights over bubbling pots while Samuel went through the books at the kitchen table, Camille doing homework nearby. Food had carried us when money couldn't. "We've had some good meals at that little table of ours," I told her, letting my voice stay light. "Sometimes the best flavors come out of small kitchens." Catherine let out a small sound, halfway between a laugh and a scoff. She covered it with her napkin, but not before it slipped free. A quiet, ugly snicker. The sound of Catherine's snicker didn't last long, but it echoed. It bounced off the glassware and plates and settled right between my ribs, not because I hadn't heard worse in my life, but because my daughter heard it and still reached for her wine instead of my hand. Some people are just more suited to home cooking, Catherine said, flicking her eyes over my dress as she lifted her fork. They get nervous around all this. She made a little circle in the air, indicating the table, the room, the whole setup, as if the space itself might overwhelm us. I straightened a little in my chair, not enough to be obvious, just enough to breathe. Before I could answer, Camille jumped in too fast. "Mom, you know my parents are fine," she said, her voice thin. "They're just simple. They like their own routines." Simple. That word slipped out of her mouth and crawled across the table slow. I watched it hit Samuel. He didn't flinch, didn't drop his gaze. His fingers just tightened once around his fork, the tendons in his hand standing out for a moment before easing again. Greg reached for the bread basket, eyes on the table. "Nothing wrong with simple," he said mildly, "as long as you know your lane." He tore off a piece of bread, dipped it into the little dish of oil like we weren't sitting right there listening. Catherine's gaze went to my shoulder then, traveling down my arm like she was checking a garment for flaws. "Sit up, dear," she murmured in my direction, her tone fake sweet. "You're slouching a bit. You'll hurt your back, and it just looks better when everyone holds themselves well at the table." I hadn't been slouching. Not until that moment. I felt my spine react before my mind did, pulling me a fraction straighter. Decades of being told to act right in other people's spaces rose like muscle memory. She watched the adjustment with satisfaction, took a sip from her glass, and then turned her attention to the corner where I'd set my tote, tucked carefully under my chair. "That little bag has seen some years, hasn't it?" she commented lightly. "I love when people hold on to sentimental things, even when they're past their prime." Donovan shifted in his seat. "Ma," he warned softly. "What?" she asked, widening her eyes. "I'm just saying I like new things. Some people." She let her voice trail off, her eyes resting on the frayed strap like it offended her. Catherine leaned slightly toward Greg then, bringing her napkin to her lips. She whispered something behind it, too low for the table, but not too low for me to feel. Her eyes never left my bag. Greg's mouth twitched. He didn't look at me, but the little huff of air from his nose told me enough. It wasn't one big insult. It was layers, thin and sharp, pressed one on top of the other until they formed something heavy. I saw all of it. But what settled the deepest wasn't Catherine's words or Greg's chuckle. It was the way Camille stared so hard at the pattern in her plate that she might as well have disappeared inside it. She knew. She felt it. And she was choosing stillness over defense. I placed my fork down carefully, the metal barely making a sound on the china. For a moment, I let myself look around that table at the polished cutlery, the curated smiles, the man I'd shared 40 years of life with, sitting quietly in clothes they thought told the whole story. Then I lifted my eyes and met Catherine's full on. "If our being here is upsetting," I said, my voice steady, "we can leave. We don't want to cause tension in your home." The whole table froze. It wasn't loud. I didn't raise my tone, didn't throw anything, didn't accuse. I just took the shame she'd been sliding onto our plates and set it back where it belonged with her. Catherine's hand jerked slightly, her wine glass chiming against the plate. "No," she said quickly, too quickly. No, please, stay. I didn't mean, it's fine. Everything's fine." Her words rushed out in a tumble, the control slipping for the first time. Greg's eyes lifted from his bread and landed on Samuel. There was something measuring in that look now, something cautious. He studied the way Samuel didn't puff up, didn't shrink, just sat there with calm in his shoulders and a softness in his eyes that didn't match the strength in his jaw. "Dinner's already on the table," Greg said, slower than before. "We're all here. No point in making a scene." He said it to the room, but he was really talking to his wife. Samuel reached for his fork again, movements easy, as if nothing had happened. "We came to spend time with our daughter," he said gently. "We don't need anything else." His eyes met mine for a heartbeat. I heard the rest of the sentence in that look. "Remember why we're here." Camille finally leaned toward me, her voice a quick, strained whisper. "Mama," she murmured, not quite looking at me. Please don't make things awkward. Dessert came out on white plates, each slice of cake arranged like an art exhibit, a drizzle, a chocolate curl, one perfect berry on top, too precious to touch. Isn't this lovely? Catherine said. Our caterer always does such beautiful work. I can't imagine fussing with sugar and flour at home. She said home like it was an insult. Camille laughed softly, eyes darting toward me. Mama loves to bake. She'll turn anything into a meal. That's sweet, Catherine replied, her tone too polished. Some people are just made for making do. Donovan cleared his throat. So, Dad, he said, how's that project at the firm? Greg waved him off. Handled. Let's not talk business tonight. Tonight's about family. The word family sat heavy. I tasted it with my first bite of cake, soft but sour. Do you ever go out to restaurants like this? Catherine asked. Or are you more home-centered? Camille laughed too loud. My parents don't like fancy places, she said quickly. Mama says the food's never enough. It was something I joked about once, never meaning it for strangers' ears. I like knowing everyone's full, I said. That's enough for me. Of course, Catherine smiled tightly. Simple tastes, there's charm in that. Some folks just never get the chance to develop broader experiences. Camille gave another nervous laugh, clutching her napkin. We're working on them, she said. I told Donovan they're set in their ways. Every word from her chipped at something small but sacred. My own daughter sanding us smooth to please someone else. Donovan's jaw ticked. Their ways raised you, he said quietly. Seems like they did something right. Embarrassment flashed across Catherine's face before she caught it. No one's questioning that, she replied. It's just when backgrounds differ. There's adjustment. We've always been intentional with the life we pictured for Camille. She didn't look at me. She looked past me. Samuel hadn't spoken since I offered to leave earlier. His silence was the kind that filled a room, calm, watching, calculating. Camille turned to him suddenly, voice too bright. Daddy, tell them about that time you tried to make that fancy dessert from TV and nearly burned the kitchen down. She laughed before he could answer. Samuel's smile was faint. We've had some experiments, he said. Kitchen's still standing. Catherine tilted her head. I imagine home is where you two are most comfortable, she said. In your element. In our skin, I replied, holding her gaze. That's where we're most comfortable. Silence followed. The clinking of forks felt loud. Camille's hand shook slightly as she reached for her drink, forcing another laugh. Donovan tried to shift the air. Dad, how's your cousin's wedding coming along? Greg answered, but something in his tone changed. His eyes drifted back to Samuel, measuring him, uncertain now. Samuel finished his cake, set his fork down, and looked at him fully. Calm, steady. A look that said nothing and revealed everything. For the first time all night, I saw confusion flicker behind Greg Carter's confidence, the beginning of a realization he couldn't yet name. By the time the plates were cleared and the last crumb of dessert disappeared, my cheeks ached from smiling. Not real smiling, just that polite curve you put on your face when you're trying not to show your teeth or your thoughts. Inside, I felt strangely calm. The kind of calm that comes when a storm has already passed through, and all that's left is what it damaged and what it exposed. Catherine dabbed at the corner of her mouth with her napkin, as if the evening had been a success. Well, she said lightly, that was nice. Nice sat on the table like a cold biscuit. Camille was already stacking plates out of habit before stopping herself, glancing at her mother-in-law for approval. Donovan caught her wrist gently. The staff's got it, babe, he murmured. Just sit. Samuel pushed his chair back slowly. Thank you for the meal, he said. His voice stayed warm. We appreciate you inviting us into your home. Catherine's smile tightened. She still hadn't fully recovered from me offering to leave earlier. Of course, she replied quickly. Family, right? She tossed the word out like a decorative pillow. Greg checked his watch, then his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, and something in his face shifted annoyance, mixed with obligation. Excuse me, he said, rising. I need to take this. It'll just be a minute. He stepped out of the dining room into the hallway. his voice low at first, then rising just enough for bits to drift back. I wasn't trying to listen. The house carried sound in a way that didn't care who it belonged to. Catherine stood and smoothed her dress. "Let me just check on the kitchen," she said. "Make sure everything's in order." She left before anyone could answer. That left the four of us, me, Samuel, our daughter, and her husband, sitting at a table that suddenly felt too big. "I'm glad y'all came," Donovan said quietly. The bravado from earlier was gone. It meant a lot to Camille. I looked at my daughter then. Really looked at her. Her shoulders were tense, her eyes tired. She met my gaze for half a second and then dropped it to her hands. "We wanted to see how she's living," I said. "Now we have a picture." Samuel's tone was neutral, almost casual. Camille flinched anyway. "Daddy." She started, then stopped. The words she needed sat on her tongue, heavy and scared. "It's been a long day," I cut in softly. "We should probably head out soon." From the hallway, Greg's voice rose above the low murmur of his call for a moment. "The zoning board won't sign off without the environmental review," he said sharply. "I already told them the numbers are preliminary. If the neighborhood committee pushes back, the council will fold." I caught Samuel's eye. That kind of talk was familiar. Permits, boards, committees, delays. It was the language of people who thought their decisions only moved on paper, not in the lives of the folks already living under those zoning lines. Greg's tone shifted, frustrated. "I'm not losing this property over a few complaints and some wetlands," he snapped. "Tell them to revise the report and schedule another hearing. I don't care how busy the calendar is." He paused, listening. "Fine. Then find someone who does know how to move it," he finished, and the call clicked off. His footsteps came back toward the dining room. Samuel rose to his feet first, smoothing his shirt, then reached for my chair with that old-fashioned care that never left him. "Come on, Nisi," he murmured. "Let's not overstay." Greg reappeared in the doorway just as I stood. His face had settled back into its composed mask, but there was an agitation still swimming under the surface. He slipped the phone into his pocket. "Apologies," he said to the room. "Local politics. Nothing thrilling." "Politics will teach you patience," Samuel replied lightly, "especially when there's boards and neighborhoods involved." Greg gave a short laugh, assuming that was the end of it. "You have no idea," he said. "Those zoning folks drag their feet for sport." Samuel adjusted his cuffs, his voice easy as he answered. "They don't move at all if you haven't already got the neighborhood with you," he said. "You know that. You're asking them to stick their necks out against voters, and they always want revised environmental numbers. That's where most projects stall." "Running care homes all these years taught me that," Samuel added. "Zoning and licensing, they're part of the job whether you want them or not." The room shifted. Greg's smile froze at the edges. His eyes landed on Samuel's face and stayed there, studying him like he was reading a document he hadn't realized he'd signed. "You've dealt with zoning boards?" he asked, the question too careful. Samuel shrugged one shoulder, that same, simple, practiced shrug he used when people underestimated him. "I've dealt with people who don't move unless you give them a reason," he answered. "Boards, councils, folks in charge tend to work the same." Nothing in his words was a boast. There were no titles, no numbers, no names, just understanding. Greg nodded slowly, replaying the call in his mind with new context. For the first time all night, he didn't seem sure of the ground he was standing on. We moved toward the front door. Camille walked beside me, silent, biting at the inside of her lip. Catherine waited by the entryway, her polite smile reattached, her eyes not quite meeting mine. "Thank you again," I said, slipping my arms into my coat. Samuel shook Greg's hand. It was a firm, steady shake, not challenge, not submission, just equal pressure. As we stepped out onto the porch, the cold air wrapped around us like relief. I felt Greg's gaze on Samuel's back, sharp and searching, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that had been in front of him all evening. We walked down the path toward the car, and I did not turn around. But I could feel it, the weight of Greg Carter's eyes, watching us leave with new caution, new questions, and a crack in the certainty he'd worn like armor all night. By the time Samuel and I pulled away from the Carter house, the sky had gone that deep, soft blue that sits between evening and night, Streetlights blinked on one by one as we turned the corner. I watched the house shrink in the side mirror, that big brick box with all its perfect lines, and felt something loosen in my chest. Samuel drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting palm up on his thigh. I laid my fingers there, feeling the warmth of him, the steady thump of his thumb against my knuckles. He didn't say anything yet. Neither did I. The quiet between us wasn't empty. It was full of everything we had seen, everything we had swallowed, everything we had decided not to show. Later, I would hear about what happened in that house after the door closed and our footsteps faded from their porch. Not that night. That night, we went home, changed out of our simple clothes, and sat at our own little table with cups of tea and the kind of silence that heals. But Camille was not resting, and Greg Carter was not at peace. Camille told me later how Greg stood in that entryway for a long moment after we left, still staring at the door like it might open again. His phone was in his hand, screen dark, thumb hovering over it without moving. Catherine fussed with the edge of the console table, straightening things that were already straight, her mouth tight. She was dramatic, Catherine muttered, meaning me, threatening to leave like that. Greg didn't answer. His mind was still back in that hallway with Samuel's voice in his ear, repeating that little sentence about boards and neighborhoods and numbers. It rolled over and over in his head, too clean to dismiss. He walked into the living room and sat down on the edge of the sofa, elbows on his knees. Camille hovered in the doorway like a child again, eyes red-rimmed, watching her father-in-law think. Donovan stood behind her with a hand on her shoulder, his fingers gentle but firm, holding her in place. The way he said it, Greg finally admitted, rubbing his temple, that wasn't guessing, that was experience. Catherine crossed her arms. Plenty of people read the news, she argued. He probably saw something online. Greg shook his head. No, he talked like someone who's sat through those meetings, someone who's had to go back and fix numbers the board didn't like. That's not a guess, that's muscle memory. The room went quiet. Camille's vision blurred. All evening she had pushed every sharp thing down, telling herself it was just one night. Now, the weight of it all, the who are these, the jabs at the tote, the jokes about making do, her own nervous laughs pressed on her chest. She slid into the nearest chair and covered her face with both hands. I let them talk about my parents like that, she choked out. I let them sit there and take it. Donovan moved to her side. Cam, he said softly, your parents handled it with more grace than any of us did tonight. His words landed heavy. Grace. That was the part hurting her the most. They had come into this house in their oldest clothes and still walked away with more dignity than the people who had tried to measure them. Catherine opened her mouth, then closed it. She knew she had overstepped. Pride fought with shame on her face, each one dragging at the corners of her mouth. She looked toward Greg for support and found him somewhere else entirely. He leaned back against the sofa, eyes fixed on a point above the mantel, replaying every word Samuel had said that evening. Not just about zoning, about patience, about people in charge, about coming only to see their daughter and needing nothing else. This man is not simple, Greg said finally. He's calm, disciplined. He let me think what I wanted to think. Donovan nodded. That's who raised Camille, he said. I've been trying to tell y'all that. Camille's shoulders shook. She was not crying from one insult or one snicker. She was crying because she had watched her parents be folded into the smallest version of themselves and had helped tuck the corners in. I need to call them, she whispered. I need to tell them I'm sorry. Not tonight, Greg answered, surprising everyone, including himself. His hand went to his phone again. Give it a minute. Let things settle. He unlocked the screen, opened his messages, and pulled up Donovan's thread, the one with their family group chat sitting right above it. His thumb hovered over a new text window. He started to type, then erased the words, started again. Denise, this is Greg Carter. I owe you and your husband an apology. He read the line in his head, saw it sitting there, saw the weight of it, the admission inside it. His jaw tightened, his pride balked. Greg's thumb hovered over the send button, then slid to the side. He locked the phone instead and set it face down on the coffee table, the unsent apology glowing quietly in the dark of his pocket. When we walked back into our own house, it felt like slipping out of a costume and into our own skin again. The air was different here, less polished, more honest. No candles trying to smell like a foreign hotel, no curated silence. Just the faint scent of the stew I'd left in the slow cooker and the soft hum of the refrigerator. Samuel hung his coat on the hook by the door and set his keys in the dish like he always did. That small, familiar sound steadied me more than anything else that night. I took my tote off my shoulder, smoothing the worn strap with my thumb. In this house, it wasn't something to be judged. It was just the bag that had carried years of groceries, paperwork, and a child's forgotten mittens. "You hungry?" I asked. Samuel gave me that look like I already knew the answer. It wasn't really about hunger. It was about routine, about putting something warm in our bodies after swallowing so much ice. "A little," he said. "Let's eat something." I went into the kitchen and lifted the lid on the pot. Steam rose, carrying the smell of beans, smoked turkey, and that seasoning I never wrote down because it lived in my hands. I scooped food into 2 bowls while Samuel laid out spoons and glasses of water. No wine glasses, no folded napkins shaped like flowers, just what we needed. We sat at the table, the same one we'd bought when Camille was 10, little knife marks and crayon ghosts still faint in the wood. For a long moment, we didn't speak. We just ate, slow, steady bites, chewing through the evening, one mouthful at a time. My phone buzzed on the counter. Once, twice, then again. I didn't move. Samuel's eyes flicked toward the sound, then back to his bowl. "You gonna get that?" he asked quietly. "Not tonight," I said. "Not yet." He didn't push. He just nodded, accepting my answer the way you accept the weather. It wasn't a storm between us, it was a shared forecast. The buzzing kept going in waves. Camille first. I knew her ring pattern. Then Donovan. Then a number I didn't recognize but could guess Greg's. Each vibration thudded against the quiet like a knock I refused to answer. I wasn't ignoring them out of spite. Spite is loud and hot. What I felt was colder and heavier. Disappointment sits deeper. It doesn't shout. It closes its doors softly and waits. "Do you want to read them?" Samuel asked after a while. I took another spoonful and let the warmth spread through my chest. "If I read them, I might respond," I said. "And I don't have words yet that won't take something out of me I'm not ready to give." He took that in, then gave a little half smile. "Take your time," he said. They had plenty of time to show who they were. We finished our meal like that, no television, no music, just the clink of spoons and the hum of our own breathing. When the bowls were empty, I stood, rinsed them in the sink, and set them in the dish rack. My phone sat on the counter. Screen lit up with notifications marching across it like little soldiers. I turned it face down. Later, when I finally checked, I would see Camille's messages. "Mama, can we talk? Please pick up. I'm sorry," stacked on top of Donovan's quiet check-ins and Greg's stiff, half-typed apology. But that night, I chose silence. My silence wasn't a weapon. It was a boundary. We went to bed early. Samuel lay on his back, one hand behind his head, staring at the ceiling. I curled on my side facing the window, watching the streetlight glow seep through the blinds. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm thinking," I answered, "about what kind of woman we raised, about what kind of woman I need to be now." He reached over, found my hand in the dark, and squeezed it once. "You don't owe them quick comfort," he said. "You owe yourself honesty." I let that settle into my bones. Outside, a car passed, tires whispering against the road. Inside, the world was finally still enough for me to feel everything I'd pushed down all evening. That same stillness didn't sit right in the Carter house. Camille told me later how, after we left, the dining room felt crowded with things unsaid. She went home with Donovan, but her body stayed tense, nerves buzzing like my phone had on the counter. Greg and Catherine lingered in their own living room, the expensive couch suddenly uncomfortable. Catherine stood by the window, arms crossed, staring out at the dark driveway. "You need to fix this, Greg," she finally said, her voice low. "I think we underestimated them." The messages started not long after we finished washing our dishes. First Camille, then Donovan, then the unknown number I knew in my bones belonged to Greg. I still didn't pick up. Sometimes the only way to show how deep a hurt went is to let the silence sit there and glow. Later, when she was finally ready to talk, Camille told me what happened that night after she left her in-laws' house. She and Donovan drove home in a quiet that felt like a third person in the car, sitting between them. She kept seeing my face at that table, the way my smile never quite reached my eyes, the way Samuel's answers stayed calm even as the room tried to shrink him. As soon as they walked into their own place, the mask she'd been holding up all evening slipped. Camille dropped her purse on the floor instead of the hook, kicked off her shoes without looking, and sat right down in the middle of the couch like her legs had given out. Donovan locked the door, watched her for a moment, and then came to sit beside her. She tried to hold herself together, blinking too fast, chest lifting in shallow breaths. It didn't last. Tears came in a rush, hot and messy, dragging the words out with them. I froze, she told him, voice cracking. I sat there and let them talk about my parents like that. Donovan didn't say anything at first. He reached for her hand, thumb tracing over her knuckles the way Samuel used to do with mine when life pushed too hard. I didn't defend them, she went on. I let my mama sit there and offer to leave like she was the problem. Her shoulders shook. My own daddy had to be the one to stay calm. They handled it better than I did. Donovan let out a slow breath. Your parents handled it with more grace than any of us did, he said, including me. She looked at him then, eyes swollen. Every time I'm around your family, I feel like I'm being measured, she whispered. Like I don't belong unless I look upgraded. I wanted you and your family to think they were small, she admitted. The truth hurt coming out, because that made me feel bigger. I thought if they looked simple, I would look upgraded. Her voice thinned on that last word. Donovan winced, not at her honesty, but at the wound underneath it. You don't need anybody to be small for you to be worthy, he told her. You're their daughter. That is what raised you, not this house or my parents' money. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, streaking mascara across her cheek. Shame sat heavy on her shoulders now, heavier than any designer fabric. They hate me, she whispered. He shook his head. They're hurt, he said. There's a difference. At the Carter house, Greg and Catherine weren't resting either. Greg sat at the kitchen island with a glass of water, his phone on the counter in front of him. The half-written apology still sat unsent on the screen. He reread the words over and over, feeling each one scrape a little at his pride. Catherine paced between the sink and the fridge, arms folded, stocking feet rustling against the tile. It wasn't that bad, she tried, more to herself than to him. People get offended so easily. Greg turned the phone face up. She offered to leave, he said, in my house, because you wouldn't stop poking at her. Catherine's mouth pressed into a thin line. I misjudged her, she admitted finally. Them. The word came out stiff. I didn't expect, she trailed off, unable to finish the thought. You didn't expect the man you were calling simple to understand my problems better than half my colleagues, Greg said. You didn't expect him to keep his dignity when you tried to strip it. That landed. Catherine sank onto the bar stool across from him, her fingers tightening around the edge. So what now? She asked quietly. We just pretend it didn't happen? He shook his head. We need a proper apology, he said. Not a text, not something quick. We need to look them in the eye and say it straight. Catherine swallowed. You want to go to their house, she said slowly. Yes, he answered. Not for business, for respect. It went against years of habits for both of them, but shame had finally grown heavier than their pride. Back at Camille's, Donovan squeezed her hand. We're not fixing this with messages, he said. We need to go there. All of us. Me, you, my parents. We show up and we apologize properly. Camille stared at their joined hands, her tears drying in salty tracks on her cheeks. The idea of standing in front of the same parents she'd allowed to be diminished, this time asking for grace instead of hiding them, scared her more than anything. All I could think about tonight, she murmured, was hoping they wouldn't embarrass me. I didn't even see how embarrassed I should have been. Donovan leaned closer, resting his forehead gently against hers. This is where you decide what kind of daughter you're going to be, he said. We can't change how tonight started. We can choose how it continues. In the quiet that followed, something in Camille cracked open the right way this time. Not to let shame in, but to let a different kind of courage out. She drew a shaky breath, lifted her head, and met his eyes. "Do you think they'll even open the door for us?" Morning came the way it always did in our house, slow light slipping through the blinds, the sound of a garbage truck in the distance, the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen before my feet ever touched the floor. Nothing about the day announced itself as special. That's how most of the important days in my life have started. Quiet, ordinary. Samuel was already up when I came out of the bedroom, a mug in his hand and his reading glasses low on his nose. The dining table was covered, not with fancy place settings, but with folders. Manila, thick, labeled in my handwriting. The life Catherine thought she could read from my shoes was spread out right there in ink and paper. "You're starting early," I said, tying my robe tighter. He smiled without looking up. "Board wants numbers by Friday," he replied. "I'm not giving them anything half-baked." I poured myself coffee and sat across from him, pulling one of the folders closer. The first tab read Hammond Care Homes, South Side. A picture of the building was clipped to the corner, printed years ago when the paint was still fresh and we were still praying the rooms would fill. We bought that first house when Camille was in middle school. Everybody thought we were crazy. It was an old place near the hospital, too big for a single family, too broken for anybody else to bother with. The bank officer had looked at our numbers twice, then at our faces like he expected us to back down. "You're taking on a lot," he'd warned. "We've carried more than this," Samuel had said. "We fixed the roof ourselves on weekends, hired cousins to paint, begged a retired nurse from our church to walk the halls with us and tell us what needed changing. Hammond Care Homes started with 6 residents who needed more help than their families could give alone. It grew, one room at a time, one person at a time, until we could buy the second house, then the third. 3 assisted living homes now. Not big, not flashy, but always full. Folks paid for care, for meals, for dignity. We paid staff, nurses, aides, kitchen workers, and after everybody got what they earned and the lights stayed on, there was still something left. I flipped to another folder. Hammond Transport Services, Contracts. That was Samuel's brainchild. Hospitals need bodies moved, he'd said. Not just ambulances. Vans, chairs, folks who can't drive themselves. It started with one used van that smelled like old plastic and determination. Now there was a small fleet, each one wrapped with our logo, making runs between clinics, dialysis centers, and our own care homes. Contracts with 3 hospitals and a handful of private practices. It wasn't glamorous work. That was the point. Most people don't look twice at the vans waiting outside back entrances. They don't look twice at the folks running them either. Samuel liked it that way. The rentals came after. Small houses and duplexes in neighborhoods people drove past without seeing. We saw them. We saw the families needing someplace steady to pay into. We bought slow, careful, one property, then another. Fix this, patch that, paint over, start again. Good tenants, fair rents. No marble countertops, but warm heaters in winter and roofs that didn't leak when it rained. Taken piece by piece, none of it looked like much. Just paperwork and keys and early mornings. But when you stack 3 care homes, a transport company, and a line of renters who pay on time because you treat them right, the numbers start to do something Catherine could never imagine from the top of her chandelier. Over 20 years, we built something that now brought in more than $100,000 a month. Not lottery money, not scandal money, just the kind that grows when you don't buy every new thing you can and you let interest and reputation do their slow work. We chose to keep living the way we always had. Same house, same table, same tote bag. Humility wasn't a costume for us. It was our first language. Growing up, both Samuel and I knew what it felt like to count coins before walking into a store. That memory never left. It guided everything we did. My phone lay on the table between the folders, face down since the night before. I'd slept, but my sleep had edges. Samuel slid one last paper into a folder and closed it. "You ready to see what your daughter has to say?" he asked gently. I stared at the phone for a long second, feeling the weight of the work around us, the life Camille had never really understood and had been so quick to shrink. Then I picked it up and turned it over. The screen lit up with a stack of messages, but one sat at the top, time-stamped just a few minutes ago. From Camille. Mom, Dad, please, we need to talk. Samuel didn't say anything right away after I read Camille's message out loud. He just leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin, eyes on the window like the answer might be written in the branches outside. Mom, Dad, please, we need to talk. The words still glowed on my screen, simple and heavy. I set the phone down between us. The table was still covered in folders from our quiet empire, our whole life spelled out in black ink. The contrast between those papers and that short line from our child made my chest tighten. You want to answer? Samuel asked finally. Yes, I said, but not fast. He nodded. Speed had never been our way. Deliberate steps had built every brick of what we owned. This moment needed the same kind of care. We let the morning move around us, coffee cooling, light shifting, the sound of a lawnmower starting up down the street. My phone buzzed once more and then went still, as if even it knew not to push. What would you have said 20 years ago? Samuel asked quietly. 20 years ago I would have rushed over there, I admitted. I would have tried to fix it all before anybody had to sit with their mess. His mouth pulled into a small, sad smile. We're not those people anymore, he said. No, I agreed. We're not. He reached for the phone then, turned it so it faced him. This is our house, he went on. Our lives, our time. If they want to make it right, they can come to where they tried to make us small. I watched his thumbs move. He didn't ask me what to type. He knew I trusted him. He wrote slowly, one careful line. You may bring them tomorrow evening. That was it. No greeting, no softening, no emojis, no explanation. Just a door cracked open, not flung wide. He showed it to me before he hit send. I read it once, felt the weight of it settle in my chest, and nodded. That's enough, I said. The message whooshed away. Somewhere across town, my daughter's phone lit up. I knew she would feel that line like a hand on her shoulder firm, not cruel. Later, she would tell me how her knees went weak reading it, how she sat on the edge of her own bed, the same way she used to sit on mine when she was a girl, clutching the phone like it might vanish. That short sentence told her everything she needed to know. We weren't shutting them out, but we weren't rushing to make them comfortable either. Donovan read it over her shoulder. That's grace, he said quietly. That's also a boundary. At the Carter house, the message landed in Greg's palm like a stone. He read it twice, then handed the phone to Catherine without commentary. You may bring them tomorrow evening. Catherine's throat worked as she swallowed. So we're going to their house, she said. Her voice had lost that automatic smoothness. Yes, Greg answered. We are. The rest of that day turned into a slow rehearsal of regret. Camille moved through her apartment, picking clothes that didn't feel like costumes. Donovan sat at the kitchen table, writing and rewriting phrases in his head he hoped he wouldn't fumble. Greg stood in front of his bathroom mirror, shoulders squared, practicing apologies he had never had to offer to anyone he'd looked down on before. I was wrong. I misjudged you. I disrespected you in your daughter's presence. The words tasted strange in his mouth, but eventually one version of the truth settled into something he could carry. Catherine lingered by her own reflection longer than usual. The makeup couldn't soften what she saw in her own eyes. Fear of being measured this time, not by money or furniture, but by the very people she'd tried to belittle. I don't want to be trapped in that little house with them angry, she muttered. They had every right to be angry in ours, Greg replied. We'll go anyway. Back at our place, the sun began to dip, pouring warm light across the living room. I stood in the doorway, seeing it the way a stranger might for the first time. The couch was clean but worn, cushions a little flattened in the middle spots where we always sat. A bookshelf lined one wall, filled with old paperbacks, church bulletins, and a few binders holding the real history of our work. Family pictures dotted the space Camille with missing teeth. Samuel in an old work jacket, me with a younger face and the same eyes. Are we straightening up? Samuel asked behind me. Yes, I said. We're not showing off. We're just being honest. We moved quietly through the room, not adding anything we didn't already live with. I straightened the afghan my mother had crocheted years ago, folded over the back of the couch. Samuel stacked the mail neatly instead of leaving it scattered. I wiped down the coffee table. That was all. No trophies came out, no bank papers laid on display. When we finished, we stood side by side, looking at the space that held our whole story, simple, clean, lived in, a room that didn't need to impress anyone to be worthy. This is enough, I said. Samuel nodded, sliding his hands into his pockets. The house was ready. We were almost ready. Our living room sat there waiting, quiet and steady, like a witness called to testify. I heard their car before I saw it, tires rolling slow over the gravel Samuel had poured himself years ago. The sound drew a straight line through my chest. I stood in the hallway, half hidden by the corner, watching the front door the way you watch a stage before the curtain rises. Samuel was beside me, steady as always. He had on the same kind of clothes he wore to that dinner, a pressed shirt, simple slacks, shoes shined enough to show respect, not show off. The difference tonight wasn't on his body, it was in the way he stood. There was no shrinking in his shoulders now, no pretense, just the man he'd always been, at home in his own house. 3 shadows passed the front window. A soft knock followed. Not loud, not timid. Careful. You ready? Samuel asked. I'm as ready as they let me be, I answered. He opened the door. Greg stood there first, a half step ahead of everyone else, not because he felt superior anymore, but because he knew this was his weight to carry. His eyes moved over Samuel's face, searching. Behind him, Catherine clutched her purse strap like a lifeline, makeup softer, eyes already glassy. Camille and Donovan stood slightly back, shoulder to shoulder, fingers laced so tight their knuckles were pale. Evening, Samuel said. His tone was neither warm nor cold. It was a straight line. Come on in. They stepped into our house and stopped just past the mat. I watched the little shifts in their faces as they looked around. They had expected small and cluttered, bare and struggling. Instead, they found simple and deliberate. The living room was the same as it had been the night before when Samuel and I finished straightening it, but tonight I saw it through their eyes. The couch wasn't new, but it was clean, cushions plumped. The coffee table carried no dust, only a small stack of coasters and a single framed picture of Camille at her college graduation, cap crooked, smile wide. Along one wall sat a sturdy bookcase, not staged, lived. Binders labeled with neat handwriting, care home staff schedules, transport contracts, rental agreements, sat beside books on business, community organizing, healthcare policy, and a thick, dog-eared copy of a local zoning manual Samuel swore he'd never read again but still kept. On the opposite side, near the window, was Samuel's workspace. Not a grand office, just a heavy wooden desk we'd bought secondhand years ago, polished by use. Papers were stacked in neat piles. Pens in a cup. A calendar open to a month full of notes and appointments. No chaos, no desperation, just order. Catherine's eyes landed on the zoning manual and stuck there. Greg's gaze caught the labels on the binders, the way they matched the conversation from his phone call. Camille's breath hitched as she realized how much of our lives she'd never really looked at. This is nice, Greg said quietly. The word wasn't filler this time. It had weight. You keep things very organized. Samuel gave a small shrug. People trust you with their lives. You don't have room for sloppy, he replied. I stepped forward then, wiping my hands on my skirt out of habit even though they were clean. Have a seat, I said. We don't have much, but what we do have is steady. That line hung there. They knew I wasn't talking about furniture. They took their places on the couch and the armchair, clustered together like a single body. Donovan sat on the edge, knees close, head bowed slightly. Camille sat beside her mother, hands twisted in her lap. She looked like a little girl again, waiting for a verdict. Samuel and I chose our usual chairs facing them, not a throne, not a witness stand. Just where we sat every night, owners of this quiet ground. Greg cleared his throat. The sound was rougher than I'd ever heard it. Mr. and Mrs. Hammond, he began, eyes flicking between us. Thank you for allowing us into your home. Thank you for coming, Samuel replied. Greg swallowed hard. I was wrong, he said. No warm-up, no excuse. I misjudged you both. I spoke to you in my home with disrespect, and I allowed my wife to speak to you that way as well, in front of your daughter. Catherine's chin trembled. Tears clung stubbornly to her lash line, refusing to fall yet. I said things I never should have said, she added, voice thin. I looked at your clothes and your bag and thought I knew your story. I made you small in my mind so I could feel big in my own house. She pressed a tissue to her eyes. I am ashamed of that, she whispered. Truly. Donovan bowed his head. I should have pushed harder to shut it down, he said. I tried, but it wasn't enough. You deserved more protection than you got in that room. Then Camille, my baby, my only child, finally broke. Tears rolled free, no mascara guard left. Mama, she cried, voice shaking. Daddy! I froze. I laughed with them. I let them shrink you to something I could present. I wanted them to see you as small so I could look like I'd climbed high. The raw honesty in that cut deeper than any insult from the night before. It was the confession of a daughter who'd stood on her parents' shoulders and then pretended she got there alone. I am so sorry, she choked out. You didn't deserve 1 second of how that night went. The room was thick with the sound of breathing, ragged, slow, careful. Shame, sorrow, dignity, and love all sat together in that small space, bumping knees. Samuel looked around at all of them, these people who had tried to measure us and now sat weighed by their own actions. He let a long silence stretch, just enough for everyone to feel it fully. Then he spoke, voice low and firm. We need to talk as a family. When Samuel said, we need to talk as a family, the room changed. The apologies had already soaked into the air, but this was different. This wasn't about them feeling better. This was about us setting the record straight. I folded my hands in my lap, feeling the old bones of my fingers, the years in them. Let me start, I said. Camille sniffed, swiping at her face, eyes fixed on me like she was bracing for impact. Catherine sat very still, both hands wrapped around her purse as if she needed something to hold on to. Greg leaned forward, forearms on his knees, no trace of his usual ease. You saw us in our oldest clothes, I began slowly. You saw my tote and Samuel's shoes and decided that was all there was. You thought simple meant small. Catherine flinched. Greg closed his eyes for a second. What you didn't see, I continued, nodding toward the bookcase, is what those binders and books actually mean. Samuel reached over and pulled one of the labeled binders from the shelf, laying it gently on the coffee table. We didn't put these out for decoration, he said. We live by what's in them. He opened it so they could see the first page, Hammond Care Homes, a list of staff, schedules, invoices. Not numbers meant to impress, proof of lives being held. We own 3 assisted living homes, I said. Started with one old house nobody else wanted. We worked, saved, reinvested. Did that over and over for more than 20 years. We take care of folks who can't manage alone anymore. They pay us to treat them like human beings. That's one part of our income. Greg's throat worked as he swallowed. Samuel tapped the next binder. Our transport contracts, he added. Hospitals, clinics, our homes. People who need rides to dialysis, appointments, rehab. We started with one van we could barely afford. Now we've got enough vehicles to keep folks moving every weekday. We don't post about it. We just show up on time. And the rentals, I said, nodding toward another binder. Small houses, duplexes. Folks who need a place that won't fall apart on them. We don't squeeze them dry. They pay us. We fix what breaks. That's it. I let the weight of it sit there a moment before I spoke again. Put all that together. After everybody is paid, every light stays on, every license and tax and insurance is settled, we clear about $100,000 a month. Catherine's hand flew to her mouth. Greg blinked slow, as if his eyes had to adjust to a new kind of light. Donovan sat back, not shocked, just relieved to hear me say what he already suspected. Camille stared at me like she was seeing a stranger and her own mother at the same time. "All this time," she whispered, voice hoarse. You had. "We had enough," I said. "Enough to live, to grow, to help when it was needed. Enough not to chase every flashy thing waved in front of us." Samuel's voice was steady. "We grew up without much. Humility wasn't a choice, it was survival. When money came, we didn't see a stage. We saw security. We chose to keep living like people who remember counting coins before walking into a store." I turned to Camille fully. "We never needed you to brag on us," I told her. "We never even needed you to understand the numbers. We just needed you not to be ashamed of the life that raised you." Her face crumpled. "Why didn't you tell me?" she cried. "Why didn't you say that you had that kind of money?" I felt a tired ache settle behind my ribs. "We didn't hide our wealth," I said quietly. "You never asked. You were so busy trying not to look like where you came from, you didn't want to look too closely at it." The truth landed like a stone dropped in water, ripples moving through each of them. Greg lowered his gaze, the shame no longer defensive but honest. "I judged you by a bag and a pair of shoes," he admitted. "Meanwhile, you were running more real work than half the men I do business with." Catherine wiped tears from her cheeks, no longer caring about smears. "I treated you like charity," she whispered, "like a burden to be managed, all while standing in front of people who could have taught me something about dignity." Donovan just shook his head slowly. "I knew y'all were solid," he said softly. "I didn't know it was this deep, but I knew enough to be ashamed of that dinner." Camille bent forward, elbows on her knees, face in her hands. Sobs rolled through her, harder now, not just from embarrassment but from the realization of how small she'd made us in her own mind to feel big somewhere else. Samuel watched her for a long moment, love and hurt sitting side by side in his eyes. Then he spoke, voice quiet but undeniable. "This won't be repaired overnight." The house was quiet after the storm of words. Apologies had been poured out, truths had been laid on the table, and still there was something left that nobody wanted to touch. That something was what came next. Camille's question, "Why didn't you tell me?" still hung in the air when Samuel said, "This won't be repaired overnight." You could feel everybody flinch at that, like he'd turned down a volume knob they were hoping to crank back up with one good cry. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the fabric underneath my palms, grounding myself in my own home. "We love you," I told Camille, making sure my voice didn't shake. "That hasn't changed. But love doesn't mean there are no consequences." She lifted her head, eyes swollen, cheeks streaked. "What does that mean?" she whispered. "It means we're going to need space," I said. The words tasted strange. "No weekly drop-ins for a while. No casual calls like nothing happened. You don't get to pretend this was just a bad night." Catherine's gaze flicked between us, suddenly understanding that this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about the way our daughter had chosen her comfort over our dignity. Donovan nodded slowly, accepting it before Camille did. "Whatever boundaries you set," he said, "we'll respect them." Samuel's eyes stayed on our daughter. "Trust isn't automatic just because we share blood," he said. "You chipped at it. Now you have to rebuild it. That's going to take time and consistency, not just tears." Camille swallowed hard. "So, you don't want to see me?" I shook my head. "We didn't say that," I answered. "We're saying we need to see different behavior, not just hear different words. We'll talk. We'll answer when it matters. But you don't get everyday access to us like nothing's wrong. Not right now." It was a small thing on the surface, less phone calls, fewer visits, but I watched it land on her like a blow. Distance can hurt more than anger because anger still feels like a door you can push against. Distance feels like that door isn't yours to knock on whenever you want anymore. Catherine blew her nose quietly, eyes lowered. "We won't invite you to use your parents to impress anyone again," she said softly. "That starts with us." Greg cleared his throat. "And I," he added, looking at Samuel, "am asking, not assuming, that we can start over. Slowly. On your terms." Samuel nodded once. "We'll see," he said. "Respect has to be lived, not just spoken." They didn't stay much longer after that. The air had grown too heavy to carry more. There were hugs, awkward, trembling ones from Camille, a firm handshake from Donovan, a quiet, almost bowed nod from Greg, a soft, whispered, "Thank you for letting us in," from Catherine. Then the door closed behind them, and our house exhaled. Time didn't sprint after that. It walked. Weeks passed. Camille called less, and when she did, she chose her words with care. No more conversations about upgrading her life. More questions about mine. Sometimes I answered. Sometimes I let the phone go to voicemail and called back when I was ready. Catherine's tone shifted in every interaction. No more sideways remarks. When she spoke to me, she used my name, not dear. When she asked a question, she waited for the answer, not the chance to speak again. It wasn't perfect, but it was deliberate. Greg sent a text one afternoon. "Samuel, if you're open to it, I'd appreciate your thoughts on a zoning matter. No obligation, no pressure." Samuel read it, sat with it, then agreed to meet for coffee, not as a favor, not as a bid for approval, but as one professional man listening to another who had finally learned to speak with respect. They talked about setbacks and hearings, about community meetings, about how projects lived or died on whether you saw people or just land. When he came home, Samuel hung his jacket and said simply, "He listened this time. I believed him. I also knew that consulting on zoning strategy didn't erase the way we'd been treated. It was just proof that Greg now understood what he'd almost thrown away. What hurt the most for Camille wasn't seeing her in-laws humbled. It was feeling the new distance between us, the shorter calls, the way I no longer rushed to fill silence with comfort. The caution in Samuel's voice when he answered her questions. One evening, she came by with Donovan, not unannounced, but not to stay long. Just to drop off some groceries she'd picked up because I saw they were on sale and thought of you. It was the kind of small kindness I'd taught her as a girl. We sat in the living room for a few minutes, the four of us. She looked around at the same house she'd once been embarrassed by, seeing it now as the center of a life she'd underestimated. "Mama?" she said suddenly, voice small. "Yes, baby?" I answered. She stared at her hands. "Do you think you'll ever see me the same again?" When Camille asked, "Will you ever see me the same again?" The room went so quiet I could hear the clock in the kitchen ticking. She didn't look at me when she said it. Her eyes stayed on the old rug under her feet, like the pattern might give her some kind of comfort. I let the question sit between us, not to punish her, but because it deserved more than a quick, easy answer. Samuel watched me from his chair, not stepping in, trusting me to say what needed to be said. "I won't see you the way I used to," I said finally. "That girl is gone. But that doesn't mean what comes next has to be worse." Her eyes lifted then, wet and fearful. "I see you more clearly now," I continued. "I see your pride, your fear, your hunger to belong. I also see your willingness to own what you did. If you keep walking in that truth, we'll build something new, different, stronger, but it won't look like before." She nodded slowly, tears slipping down again, but there was something steadier in her this time, a surrender that didn't feel like defeat, just acceptance. Months passed, not rushing, not dragging, just moving the way life does when people are trying to change for real. The calls came less often at first. When Camille did ring, she didn't launch into stories about events or upgrades. She asked how my knees were holding up, asked Samuel how the new nurse at the Southside home was working out. She listened more. If I couldn't talk, she didn't take it as rejection. She took it as consequence and kept showing up anyway. She started visiting the care homes sometimes. Not for show, no cameras, no posts, just quiet walks down the halls beside Samuel, listening to him talk about residents, staff, regulations. She folded blankets in the laundry room, helped serve meals, learned names. That kind of work has a way of sanding down the sharp edges of pride. Catherine changed in smaller but steady ways. When we crossed paths at Camille's place, or the occasional merged family gathering, her voice had lost that polished bite. She no longer introduced me as Marcus's simple mother-in-law, the way she had in her stories. Now it was Denise who runs those homes I told you about, or simply Denise, with no commentary attached. Her respect was careful, not dramatic. She asked permission before giving opinions. She brought food sometimes not as an offering to impress, but as a shared gesture, a way of saying, "I can learn too." The first time she asked me for a recipe instead of mocking my kitchen, I felt something unclench just a little. Greg's shift was quieter still, but just as real. He and Samuel began meeting from time to time, sometimes at a coffee shop, sometimes at our table. At first, it was zoning questions, community pushback, trying to navigate council meetings without bulldozing people. Over time, the conversations moved beyond permits into people. "I thought success was just building bigger," Greg admitted once. "I didn't realize how much of it is making sure you don't crush the ones already standing on the ground you're building on." Samuel just nodded. "Land remembers how you treat the folks on it," he said. "Communities do too." They didn't become best friends. That wasn't the point. They became two men who could look each other in the eye without pretense. Respect replaced assumption. The distance between us and Camille didn't vanish. It thinned. She stopped trying to rush past it. Some Sundays she came by and just sat at the table while I chopped vegetables, talking about nothing special. Work, weather, the latest small disaster at her job. Other Sundays, she stayed home, and I felt the space like a healing wound, not healed, not bleeding, just tender. One evening, months after that dinner, we all ended up in the same place again, our house this time. No special occasion, just a shared meal. Donovan helped Samuel carry in chairs from the back porch. Catherine set the table without fussing over matching napkins. Greg asked if he could help with the dishes afterward, and actually meant it. Camille watched all of it with quiet eyes. I could see the way she studied me and Samuel now, less like people she was afraid might embarrass her, more like a foundation she was finally learning to stand on without shame. Later that night, after everyone left, Samuel and I sat alone in the living room. The house was still, the same as always. No new furniture, no framed bank statements. Just our life, worn smooth by use. "You think she's changing?" Samuel asked. "Yes," I said. "The right way." "Slow." He reached for my hand. "Us too," he added. He was right. We had changed as well, firmer with our boundaries, clearer about our worth, more willing to let our silence speak when words weren't enough. If you had walked past our house that night, you wouldn't have seen anything special. Just an older couple sitting in a modest living room, lights low, shadows soft, no luxury cars in the driveway, no designer logos in the window. But inside, something important had settled into place. Camille was learning that love comes with accountability. The Carters were learning that money doesn't buy character. And Samuel and I were standing exactly where we'd always stood, on the solid ground we built, one quiet decision at a time. In the end, that's what I held on to. True wealth does not announce itself. It watches who people become when they believe you have nothing. Did you like the story? Let's meet in the comments. If you liked the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story.